She signed the divorce papers in tears, broken and pregnant, while her husband walked away with a billionaire heiress. He told her she was too small for his world. 7 years later, she walked into his boardroom as the CEO he desperately needed, but he didn't recognize her. Not at first. What he didn't know, she'd been planning this moment for 2,555 days, and the secret she brought back would destroy everything he built. This is Claire Montgomery's story. If you love epic comebacks, hit like and subscribe. Drop a comment, would you forgive or fight back? Now let's see how one woman turned her greatest betrayal into her most powerful weapon. The champagne flutes glittered like stars across the Manhattan penthouse ballroom. Claire Montgomery stood at the center of the crowd, a vision in emerald silk. Her dark hair swept into an elegant twist that spoke of old money and new power. Around her, New York's elite whispered behind their cocktails, their eyes following her every movement. She was supposed to be dead. Across the room, Derek Hastings froze mid-conversation, his hand tightening around his glass until his knuckles turned white. The woman he'd destroyed 7 years ago was laughing with the mayor, commanding the space like she owned it. Because she did. The building, the company, the future he'd once promised himself, all belonged to her now. Derek, Madison Sinclair's manicured nails dug into his arm. What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost. He had. The ghost wore designer heels and a smile that promised revenge, served ice cold. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Every empire built on ashes has a story. This one begins 7 years earlier, with a woman who believed in love and a man who believed only in winning. It was supposed to be their 5th wedding anniversary. Claire had spent the afternoon preparing Derek's favorite meal, roasted chicken with rosemary potatoes, the dish she'd made the night he proposed. The Brooklyn loft they shared overlooked the bridge, and she'd lit candles along every surface, creating a constellation of hope in the growing darkness. In her pocket, the pregnancy test felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. She'd taken 3 tests that morning, each one blooming with those 2 pink lines that meant everything was about to change. They talked about children, of course. In those early years when Derek would pull her close on Sunday mornings and sketch their future in lazy whispers. 2 kids, he'd said, maybe 3. A brownstone in Park Slope, birthday parties in the backyard, growing old together. The door opened at 10:30 p.m. 4 hours late, Derek walked past her without a word, his attention fixed on his phone, thumbs flying across the screen. His suit jacket hung perfectly despite the long day, his cologne expensive and unfamiliar. You're late, Claire said softly, hating how small her voice sounded. I told you I had a meeting. You said you'd be home by 6. It's our anniversary. Derek glanced up, his expression blank for a moment before recognition flickered. Right, sorry, things ran long. His phone buzzed. He looked down immediately, and Claire saw the name flash across the screen. M.S. Who's that? The question escaped before she could stop it. Madison Sinclair, Roger Sinclair's daughter. He's investing $40 million in the company. Derek moved past her toward the bedroom, already loosening his tie. I need to shower. Long day. Claire followed him, her heart hammering. Derek, I need to tell you something. Something important. Can it wait? I'm exhausted. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Derek stopped, his hand on the bathroom door, his back to her. The silence stretched so long that Claire could hear her own heartbeat, could count the seconds between breaths. When he finally turned around, his face was unreadable. What? I'm pregnant, about 6 weeks. She tried to smile, tried to remember how she'd imagined this moment going. I know we weren't exactly planning it right now, but Derek, we're going to have a baby. He stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression, something cold and calculating that she'd never seen before. No, he said finally. We're not. The candles flickered, the city lights blurred, and Claire felt the first crack spider across her heart. What do you mean? Derek sat on the edge of their bed, rubbing his temples like she was giving him a headache. This isn't the right time, Claire. The Sinclair deal is about to close. Madison's father wants family unity, stable partnerships. Madison's pregnant too, and Roger wants one clear heir involved in the business structure. The words made no sense. Claire shook her head, trying to understand. Madison's pregnant. What does that have to do with us? Everything. Derek looked at her then. really looked at her, and she saw it. The truth she'd been avoiding for months, written plainly in his eyes. Madison and I are together, Claire, have been for 8 months. Her father's investment depends on our marriage, on our family. The floor tilted. Claire grabbed the doorframe, her vision swimming. You're leaving me for her. I'm leaving you for what she can offer. There's a difference, see? He stood, straightening his cuffs with the same casual efficiency he used in boardroom negotiations. You're a good person. Claire, you always have been, but you're not built for the world I'm entering. Madison understands what it takes to succeed. You just understand how to survive. I gave up everything for you, Claire whispered. I turned down the fellowship in Rome. I worked 2 jobs to help pay off your business school loans. I believed in you when no one else did, and I'm grateful. He said it like he meant it, which somehow made it worse. But gratitude doesn't build empires. The prenup is clear. You'll get $50,000. That's more than fair. He walked past her toward the door, and Claire realized he was leaving. Not tomorrow, not next week. Right now, on their anniversary, with their unborn child growing inside her. Derek, please. She hated herself for begging, but she couldn't stop. Don't do this. We can work this out. I love you. He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. I know you do. That's the problem. Love doesn't pay the bills. Claire, love doesn't build what I'm building. Love is a luxury I can't afford anymore. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the end of the world. The divorce proceedings moved with brutal efficiency. Derek's lawyers were sharks in $1,000 suits, and Claire's court-appointed attorney looked exhausted before they even began. The prenuptial agreement she'd signed 5 years ago, young and stupidly in love, left her with nothing. Not the apartment they'd bought together, not the design work she'd contributed to Derek's company, nothing but $50,000 and the clothes on her back. Madison Sinclair attended every hearing, her growing belly a pointed reminder of everything Claire was losing. She dressed in soft pastels and pearls, playing the role of the demure heiress while photographers snapped their pictures on the courthouse steps. The tabloids ate it up. Real estate mogul chooses empire over love. Hastings heir marries into Sinclair fortune. Claire became the footnote in someone else's success story. The final hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in late November. Rain hammered the city in gray sheets, turning the streets into rivers. Claire stood in front of the bathroom mirror in her best interview suit, the one she'd been saving for job interviews that never came. Her reflection looked hollow, dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights. At 12 weeks pregnant, she was just starting to show. She pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the small swell beneath her palm. Just you and me now, she whispered. We're going to be okay. She didn't believe it, but saying the words out loud made them feel possible. The courthouse was packed with people escaping the rain. Claire's lawyer, Julia Pierce, met her in the hallway, her expression grim. They're offering a settlement. $75,000 if you sign today and agree to a non-disclosure agreement about the marriage. A non-disclosure, Claire's voice cracked. So I can't even tell anyone what he did. That's the offer. Take it or fight this out for another 6 months with no guarantee you'll get more. Julia's eyes were kind but realistic. Claire, I've seen cases like this before. Men like Derek Hastings always win. Take the money, disappear, build a new life. Build a new life. As if it were that simple. As if she could just shed her skin and become someone else. Fine, Claire said. I'll sign. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, all dark wood and fluorescent lights. Derek sat with his lawyers on the opposite side, looking bored, checking his watch every few minutes. Madison waited in the gallery, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. The judge spoke words Claire barely heard. Dissolution of marriage. Asset distribution. Final decree. Then they placed the papers in front of her, and she was holding a pen that felt heavier than her entire future. Her hand shook as she signed her name. Once, twice, 3 times. Each signature felt like a small death. The erasure of everything she'd believed in. Love. Partnership. Forever. Outside, the rain had intensified. Claire stood on the courthouse steps, clutching the envelope with her settlement check, feeling the world spin around her. Behind her, she heard laughter. Derek and Madison emerging from the building, protected by an umbrella held by Derek's assistant. A black Bentley waited at the curb. Madison saw her first. She whispered something to Derek, and they both looked at Claire with expressions of pity mixed with contempt. Then Madison did something that would replay in Claire's nightmares for years. She walked over, pulled another envelope from her designer purse, and pressed it into Claire's hands. An extra $25,000, Madison said sweetly. Derek wanted to be generous. Consider it a fresh start fund. Now you can disappear properly. Claire looked down at the envelope, then up at the woman who'd stolen her life. Something inside her cracked. Not broke, cracked. The difference mattered. Keep your money, Claire said, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. I don't want anything from either of you. Suit yourself. Madison's smile sharpened. Just do us all a favor and stay gone. Derek's moving on. You should too. They left. The Bentley pulled away from the curb, and Claire stood there in the rain, soaked to the skin, watching the red taillights disappear into the Manhattan traffic. That's when the pain hit. Sharp and sudden, low in her abdomen. Claire gasped, doubling over. The courthouse steps were slippery, and she lost her footing, tumbling down 3 stone steps before catching herself. The pain intensified, spreading through her body like fire. Someone screamed. Claire realized dimly that it was her. People rushed to help, voices blurring together. Ambulance. Pregnant. Bleeding. The words came from far away, like she was underwater and everyone else was on the surface. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was the gray sky above Manhattan, heavy with rain, and the thought that echoed through her fading consciousness. This is how it ends. This is how I disappear. But she was wrong. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger, much darker, and much more dangerous than anything she could have imagined. Claire woke to the sound of classical music and the smell of fresh flowers. Her body ached, but the pain in her abdomen had dulled to a distant throb. She opened her eyes slowly, expecting the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital emergency room. Instead, she found herself in what looked like a luxury hotel suite. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park. Original artwork hung on cream-colored walls. Medical equipment beeped softly beside her bed, but everything else screamed wealth and privacy. A man sat in a leather chair by the window, reading the Wall Street Journal. He was older, maybe mid-40s, with silver threading through his dark hair and the kind of face that belonged on magazine covers. He wore an impeccably tailored suit and held himself with the confidence of someone who'd never heard the word no. You're awake, he said, folding the paper precisely. How are you feeling? Where am I? Claire tried to sit up, but dizziness forced her back down. Is the baby okay? Your sons are stable. You're in a private medical suite. You've been here for 2 days. He stood, moving to pour water from a crystal pitcher. I'm Grant Westbrook. Your father saved my life 20 years ago. Now I'm returning the favor. Claire took the water with shaking hands. My father, Charles Montgomery, was a high school teacher. He died when I was 16. Your father was many things. Miss Montgomery, a teacher, was only one of them. Grant pulled his chair closer, his expression serious. Charles Montgomery worked for the CIA as a handler for corporate whistleblowers. I was one of his assets. When my testimony against a defense contractor put a price on my head, your father gave me a new identity and a second chance at life. He made me promise that if anything ever happened to him, I'd watch over you. The words sounded insane, like something from a thriller novel, but the man's eyes held nothing but truth. Sons, Claire whispered suddenly. You said sons, plural. Grant nodded. You're carrying twins. The fall caused early contractions, but Dr. Brooks managed to stabilize the pregnancy. However, he paused, choosing his words carefully. It's high risk now. You'll need complete bed rest, careful monitoring, and probably an early delivery. Twins. Claire pressed her hands to her stomach, feeling the reality of it settle over her. Not one baby, but two. 2 reasons to survive. 2 reasons Derek could never find out about. Why are you helping me? She asked. Because I owed your father everything. And because I looked into Derek Hastings after finding you on those courthouse steps. Grant's expression hardened. Your ex-husband is in business with some very dangerous people. Roger Sinclair's fortune wasn't built on legitimate investments. It was built on weapons deals, money laundering, and bribes to foreign officials. Your father was investigating those connections when he died. Claire's blood went cold. My father's car accident. It wasn't an accident, was it? No, but I can't prove it. Not yet. Grant leaned forward. Which is why you need to disappear. Claire, Derek Hastings is about to inherit those same criminal connections through his marriage to Madison. If he discovers you're carrying his children, they become leverage, hostages, casualties. The room spun. Claire thought about Derek's cold eyes when he told her to get rid of the pregnancy, about Madison's smug smile on the courthouse steps, about power and money, and how little her life had mattered in the face of both. What do you want from me? She finally asked. Nothing. I want to give you something. A chance to rebuild away from Derek's reach. I have properties in Europe, Scotland, Switzerland, London, places where you and your sons can grow up safely, quietly, invisibly. Grant pulled an envelope from his jacket. Inside is a new identity, bank accounts, medical care arrangements, everything you need to vanish. And in return, stay gone. Let Derek Hastings think you're dead or disappeared forever. Raise your sons, build a new life. His eyes held a challenge. Or stay here and watch him destroy you piece by piece. Your choice, Oremik. Claire looked out the window at the park below. Mothers pushed strollers along paths lined with autumn leaves. Children played on swings, their laughter silent through the thick glass. A whole world of normal people living normal lives, unaware of the darkness lurking in penthouses and boardrooms. She thought about her father, who'd lived a secret life to protect people like Grant, about the babies growing inside her, innocent and vulnerable, about the woman she'd been, naive enough to believe love conquered all. That woman was dead. She died on the courthouse steps. When do we leave? Claire asked. Grant smiled. Tonight, pack light. Wear your gang. You won't need reminders of who you used to be. The years passed like chapters in someone else's story. Claire became Claire Brennan, a name borrowed from her grandmother's maiden name. She landed first in Edinburgh, then London, then finally Zurich, each move taking her further from the woman she'd been. The twins didn't make it. At 28 weeks, complications forced an emergency delivery. Only one baby survived the early birth. Ethan Montgomery, 3 pounds and fighting for every breath. Spent 3 months in the neonatal intensive care unit. Claire lived in that hospital, sleeping in chairs, learning to feed him through tubes smaller than coffee straws, praying to gods she'd stop believing in. When they finally came home, it was to a modest apartment overlooking Lake Zurich. Grant had kept his distance. True to his word, the help came in the form of medical bills paid anonymously, educational funds that appeared when needed, and a job offer at a small architecture firm that didn't ask too many questions about gaps in her resume. Claire worked. God, how she worked. 70-hour weeks, learning European building codes, studying sustainable design, clawing her way up from junior draftsman to project manager to lead designer. Every promotion felt like armor, every success a shield between her past and present. Ethan grew up bilingual, speaking German in school and English at home. He had Derek's blue eyes and her stubborn chin, a combination that sometimes made her heart ache. But he was gentle where Derek had been ruthless, curious where Derek had been calculating. Ethan collected rocks and read books about dinosaurs and asked questions about everything except the one thing that mattered. Where is my father? He's not in our lives. Claire would say when Ethan was old enough to ask, "It's just you and me. Is that okay?" "More than okay," Ethan always replied. "We're a team." They were others, the best team Claire had ever known. By year 4, Claire's sustainable housing design won an international competition. The award brought attention from Westbrook Global, Grant's development company. He offered her a position as senior architect. No strings attached, no favors owed. "You earned this on your own merit," Grant said over coffee in a Geneva cafe. "But I'd be a fool not to hire the best designer in Europe." She took the job, not because of Grant, but because of what it represented. Proof that she'd survived. Proof that Derek Hastings hadn't destroyed her, just temporarily derailed her. By year 6, Claire was vice president of European operations. She traveled constantly, Ethan in tow or with trusted nannies, building eco-friendly towers in Amsterdam and Copenhagen and Prague. Her designs won awards. Her name appeared in architecture journals. She was becoming someone. Then came the call that changed everything. "I'm opening a New York headquarters," Grant said during a video conference. Behind him, the Manhattan skyline glittered with familiar menace. "I want you to lead it, Chief Executive Officer of Westbrook Global Development. Full creative control. Whatever resources you need." Claire's hand tightened on her coffee mug. "I can't go back there." "You're not going back, Claire. You're going forward as someone Derek Hastings can't touch. You're not the woman he destroyed. You're the woman he created." Grant's expression was carefully neutral. "And there's something else you should know. Hastings Development is failing. They're $400 million in debt. Roger Sinclair died last year, and his fortune is tied up in federal investigations. Madison's trust fund is frozen. Derek is desperate." "Good," Claire said coldly. "Better than good. It's an opportunity." Grant pulled up financial documents on screen. "I've been quietly buying Derek's debt for years. He doesn't know it yet, but I control his company's future. One wrong move, and I can destroy everything he's built." Claire's heart hammered. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve the chance to face him, not as a victim, but as an equal." Grant leaned forward. "I'm not asking you to get revenge, Claire. I'm offering you the chance to prove that the best revenge is simply outliving your enemy's relevance." She thought about it for 3 days, talked it over with Ethan, who at 7 was wise beyond his years. "Mom," he said, "are you scared of going back?" "Yes," she admitted. "But you always tell me that brave doesn't mean not scared. It means doing it anyway." Out of the mouths of children, Claire bought the plane tickets. 2 weeks later, she stood in front of the mirror in her Zurich apartment, wearing a power suit that cost more than her first car. Ethan hugged her legs. "You look like a superhero," he said. "Just a woman going to work." Claire replied, but when she looked at her reflection, she saw someone new, someone harder, someone ready. The flight to New York felt like flying toward a storm. Claire kept Ethan busy with movies and coloring books, but her mind raced ahead to the inevitable confrontation. What would she say? How would Derek react? Would he even recognize her? Grant met them at JFK with a car service and a brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, ironically just blocks from where she'd lived with Derek. "Poetic, isn't it?" Grant said. "You get to reclaim the neighborhood." The first board meeting was scheduled for Monday morning. Claire spent the weekend preparing, memorizing every detail of the Manhattan Skyline project, the massive redevelopment that would define New York's future. Hastings Development was supposed to be the lead partner, but financial troubles had opened the door for Westbrook Global to step in. Monday morning arrived with perfect autumn clarity. Claire dropped Ethan at his new school, kissed his forehead, and headed into Manhattan. The Hastings Development Tower gleamed in the sunlight, all glass and steel and arrogance. She rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, her reflection calm in the polished doors. When they opened, she stepped into the conference room where Derek Hastings sat reviewing contracts, completely unaware that his past had just walked back into his future. Derek looked older. The 7 years had added gray to his temples and lines around his eyes. That expensive moisturizer couldn't quite erase. But he still carried himself with that same confidence, that certainty that the world existed to serve his ambitions. He glanced up when the conference room door opened, his expression already shifting into his boardroom smile. Then he saw Claire, and the smile froze. His face went pale. The folder in his hand slipped, papers scattering across the polished table. "Good morning," Claire said pleasantly, taking the seat directly across from him. "I'm Claire Brennan, CEO of Westbrook Global Development. I don't believe we've met." The lie hung between them like smoke. Derek stared at her, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Grant entered behind her, followed by 6 other board members, all business and briefcases and completely unaware of the earthquake happening in slow motion. "Derek," Grant said easily, shaking his hand. "Good to see you. I believe you've now met my CEO. Claire comes highly recommended. 15 years of architectural experience, award-winning sustainable design portfolio, fluent in 5 languages. We're lucky to have her." 15 years, Derek finally found his voice, though it came out strangled. "But you look exactly like—" "I get that a lot," Claire interrupted smoothly. "Apparently I have one of those faces." Shall we begin? I understand we're here to discuss partnership terms for the Manhattan Skyline project. She opened her laptop, projecting slides onto the screen with practiced efficiency. Every word was crisp, professional, unshakable. Derek kept staring at her like she was a hallucination. And she let him wonder, let him doubt his own sanity. The other board members noticed nothing unusual. They were too busy being impressed by Claire's presentation, her innovative designs, her cost projections that would save the project millions. She spoke about green building materials and renewable energy integration, about creating housing that served communities instead of just extracting profit. Everything Derek's company wasn't. After 90 minutes, Grant called for a break. The board members filed out for coffee, leaving just Claire, Derek, and the weight of 7 years between them. Derek stood abruptly. Claire, it is you. I know it's you. My name is Claire Brennan, she said calmly, not looking up from her notes. And I don't appreciate being confused with someone else during a professional meeting. Stop it, his voice cracked. Where have you been? Everyone thought you were dead. There was no trace, no forwarding address, nothing. I looked. Did you? She finally met his eyes. How hard could you have looked? You were pretty busy getting married, having a child, building your empire on your father-in-law's dirty money. His jaw clenched. You don't know anything about my business. I know everything about your business, Mr. Hastings, including the $400 million in debt you're carrying, the federal investigation into Roger Sinclair's estate, the frozen assets, the vendors you haven't paid in 6 months. She smiled coldly. I know you're drowning, and you need Westbrook Global to throw you a lifeline. The question is, why should we? Derek sank back into his chair. What do you want? I want to complete this project on time and under budget. I want to build something that matters. What do you want, Mr. Hastings? She packed up her laptop with deliberate slowness. Because if you want to dredge up the past, if you want to make this personal, I promise you'll regret it. I'm not who I used to be. I'm someone you can't afford to underestimate twice. She left him sitting there, and it felt like the first real breath she'd taken in 7 years. The partnership between Westbrook Global and Hastings Development was announced the following week. Business reporters called it a surprising alliance. Smart observers called it a rescue mission. Claire called it the beginning of Derek's end. She threw herself into the Manhattan Skyline project with focused intensity. Long hours at the site, meetings with contractors, design reviews that stretched past midnight. Ethan adapted to New York better than she'd hoped, making friends at his new school, excited about pizza and baseball and all the things American kids loved. Grant watched over them both with the protective eye of someone who understood what they risked by coming back. Be careful, he warned one evening. Derek's asking questions about you, about me, about why I hired someone who looks exactly like his dead ex-wife. Let him ask, Claire said. He can't prove anything. But Derek wasn't the only one asking questions. Madison Sinclair had noticed too. She appeared at the construction site one afternoon, designer sunglasses and designer resentment. Her figure still perfect years after pregnancy. So you're the mysterious Claire Brennan, Madison said, her smile sharp enough to cut. Derek seems very interested in you. Almost obsessed, really. I'm his business partner. Of course he's interested. Claire didn't look up from the blueprints she was reviewing. Is that all you are? Madison stepped closer. Because I've seen the way he looks at you. Like you're a ghost he can't quite believe in. Claire finally met her eyes. Maybe that's because he's been haunted by his choices for a long time. Guilt has a way of manifesting in strange ways. I don't think it's guilt. Madison's voice dropped. I think you're her. The first wife, the woman who vanished. And I think you came back to destroy us. Destroy you? Claire laughed genuinely. Madison, you don't need my help for that. You're doing fine on your own. How's your father's legal defense fund? Must be hard, watching federal prosecutors pick apart his legacy while your trust fund sits frozen. Madison's face flushed. You have no idea what you're talking about. Don't I? Claire gathered her blueprints. I know that Roger Sinclair built his fortune on illegal weapons deals. I know your lifestyle was funded by blood money. I know Derek married you for access to that money. And now that it's gone, he's regretting every choice that led him here. That's not my fault, Madison. That's just karma coming due. She walked away, leaving Madison trembling with rage on the construction site. It was a tactical error. Claire knew that even as she made it, never wound an enemy without finishing them. But sometimes the satisfaction was worth the risk. The consequences came faster than expected. That night, Claire was putting Ethan to bed when her phone exploded with notifications. Someone had leaked a story to a gossip blogger, Mystery CEO's secret connection to Hastings Development. Alongside it, old photos, Claire on her wedding day, Claire and Derek at charity events, Claire signing divorce papers on courthouse steps, and newer photos, Claire and Ethan at his school, close-ups that showed Ethan's face clearly, his blue eyes, the shape of his jaw, the unmistakable resemblance to Derek Hastings. "Mom," Ethan looked up from his book. "Why is your phone buzzing so much?" Claire silenced it with shaking hands. "Just work stuff. Sweetheart. Nothing important." But it was important. It was everything. By morning, the story had gone viral. Social media sleuths had done DNA analysis through photos, comparing Ethan's features to Derek's childhood pictures. The hashtag Hastings Secret Heir was trending nationwide. Grant called at 6 a.m. "We need to talk." Now, they met at a coffee shop in Brooklyn, away from cameras and reporters who were already camping outside the Westbrook Global offices. Grant looked grim. "Derek's lawyers filed an emergency petition this morning. They're demanding a paternity test." "He has no right." Claire's hands clenched around her coffee cup. "He has every right if Ethan is his biological son. And Claire, we both know he is." Grant's voice was gentle but firm. "You need to prepare for this. Derek's not going to let this go on. Then we fight it. He abandoned me. He told me to get rid of the pregnancy. He doesn't get to suddenly claim fatherhood now. In court, it won't matter what he said 7 years ago if there's no documentation. It's your word against his." Grant leaned forward. "I have lawyers. Good ones. But Claire, you need to understand what's about to happen. This is going to get ugly. They'll drag your name through the mud, question your fitness as a mother, accuse you of parental alienation. Derek has money and connections and nothing left to lose." Claire thought about Ethan, asleep and innocent back at the brownstone, about the life she'd built brick by careful brick, about how quickly everything could crumble. "What do I do?" she whispered. "We prepare for war," Grant said, "and we hope we're strong enough to survive it." The court date arrived with brutal speed. Derek's lawyers moved with the efficiency of sharks who smelled blood. Within 72 hours, they had DNA evidence, court orders, and a custody petition that painted Claire as an unstable woman who'd kidnapped her own child to punish his father. The narrative they built was masterful in its cruelty. Poor Derek, and they said, had been devastated when his pregnant wife vanished after their divorce. He'd searched for years, hired investigators, spent hundreds of thousands trying to find her. Now that she'd surfaced, all he wanted was a relationship with the son he'd never known. It was complete fiction, but it sounded better than the truth. Claire stood in family court wearing her armor of expensive clothing and professional success. But underneath, she was terrified. Ethan sat in a waiting room with a social worker, confused about why strangers kept asking him questions about his life. Derek sat across the aisle with Madison and a team of lawyers. He'd lost weight, looked haggard, but his eyes when they met Claire's held something dangerous. Not love, not even hate. Desperation. The judge was a stern woman in her 60s who'd clearly seen every parental conflict imaginable. She reviewed the petition with sharp eyes, then looked up at Derek's lead attorney. "Mr. Hastings claims he was unaware of the child's existence until 2 weeks ago." "That's correct, Your Honor. Miss Montgomery, or Miss Brennan, as she now calls herself, deliberately concealed the pregnancy and disappeared. My client has been deprived of 7 years of his son's life." "Miss Brennan?" The judge turned to Claire. "Is this accurate?" Claire stood. "Your Honor, I was pregnant when my marriage to Mr. Hastings ended. He was aware of the pregnancy. He told me explicitly to terminate it because his new partner was also pregnant, and it complicated his business arrangements with her father. I fled because I feared for my safety and my unborn child's safety." "Do you have documentation of this conversation?" "No, Your Honor. It was a private conversation." The judge's expression gave nothing away. "Mr. Hastings, you were aware of the pregnancy." Derek stood, and Claire hated how easily he slipped into the role of wounded father. I was told my wife was pregnant. Yes, but then she vanished before we could discuss our options. I never told her to terminate anything. I wanted that child. I still want to know my son. Liar. The words screamed through Claire's mind, but she kept her face neutral. In court, emotions were weaknesses. The proceedings dragged on for hours. Expert witnesses testified about the importance of father figures. Child psychologists discussed attachment and parental rights. Through it all, Claire felt control slipping through her fingers like water. Then came the moment that shattered everything. The judge ordered a temporary custody arrangement while the full case proceeded. The child will spend weekends with Mr. Hastings, supervised by a court-appointed guardian, while we evaluate the full situation. Your Honor, no. Claire stood so fast her chair scraped. You don't understand what kind of man he is. Miss Brennan, sit down. My order stands. Ethan will have supervised visits with his father starting this weekend. We'll reconvene in 30 days to assess the situation. The gavel came down like a guillotine. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Claire pushed through them, trying to reach Ethan before Derek's team could, but they were faster. She watched helplessly as two lawyers and a social worker led Ethan toward a black car. He looked back at her, confused and scared. Mommy. It's okay, baby. Claire fought to keep her voice steady. It's just for a few days. I'll see you soon. I don't want to go. Tears streamed down his face. Mom, please. Derek appeared then, kneeling in front of Ethan with a gentle smile that made Claire want to scream. Hey, buddy, I'm your dad. We're going to have a great time together. Okay, we'll go to the park. Get ice cream, whatever you want. Ethan looked at this stranger claiming to be his father, then back at Claire. She nodded through her own tears. What choice did she have? The law had spoken. She watched the car drive away, taking half her heart with it. Grant put a hand on her shoulder. We'll fix this. But Claire was learning that some things, once broken, stayed broken no matter how hard you tried to mend them. The weekend visits became weekly visits. Weekly visits became shared custody. Derek's lawyers were relentless, using every legal maneuver available. They painted Claire as vindictive, unstable, a woman who'd robbed a father of his child. The media ate up the story. CEO's secret son scandal dominated news cycles. Claire's professional life began to crumble. Westbrook Global's board, nervous about the publicity, called emergency meetings. Conservative members worried about the company's reputation. Two major investors threatened to pull funding. Grant fought for her, but even he couldn't stop what came next. We're suspending you pending the outcome of the custody case, the board chairman announced. It's temporary, just until things settle down. You're firing me because I'm a single mother fighting for my child. Claire couldn't believe it. We're protecting the company's interests. Surely you understand. She understood perfectly. Power only protected you until it didn't. Success was conditional on playing by rules written by people who'd never had to fight for anything. The financial attacks came next. Derek's team filed complaints with the IRS, triggering an audit. Her bank accounts were frozen pending investigation of tax fraud that didn't exist. Her credit cards were suddenly declined. The Brownstones' lease was mysteriously terminated by the landlord, who'd received a very generous offer from an anonymous buyer. Within 3 weeks, Claire went from CEO to unemployed and homeless. She moved into a budget hotel in Queens with Ethan, the kind of place where the neighbors fought at 2 a.m. and the walls were so thin you could hear everything. It was temporary, she told herself, just until she got back on her feet, just until the legal system recognized the truth. But the system wasn't interested in truth. It was interested in money and power. And Derek had both. Then came the call that nearly destroyed her. Ethan was in the hospital. He'd collapsed during a visit with Derek, unconscious and unresponsive. Claire raced to Mount Sinai, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Dr. Brooks met her in the waiting room, her expression grave. Ethan has a rare genetic condition. It's been dormant, but stress can trigger episodes. He needs surgery immediately, but it's not covered by standard insurance. The procedure costs $500,000. The number hit Claire like a physical blow. I don't have that. My accounts are frozen. I can't. We can apply for hospital assistance, But the approval process takes weeks. Ethan doesn't have weeks. Claire, he needs this surgery within 48 hours, or the damage to his heart becomes irreversible. Claire sank into a plastic chair, her world narrowing to a single point of pain. Everything she'd built, everything she'd fought for, and she couldn't save her own son. Derek appeared in the hallway looking properly concerned for the cameras following him. Claire, I just heard. This is terrible. Get away from me. She could barely speak through the rage. I want to help. I'll pay for the surgery. All of it. Whatever he needs. Derek crouched in front of her, his voice low. But you need to sign something first. Full custody. You sign over your parental rights, and I'll authorize the surgery immediately. The words didn't make sense. Claire shook her head. What? Ethan needs a stable home. You're broke, unemployed, living in a hotel. I can give him everything. The best schools, the best life. You sign over custody, and I save his life. It's that simple. You're blackmailing me, using our son's life to force custody. Claire looked at him with absolute clarity. You're not human. You're a monster. I'm a father protecting his child. Sign the papers. Claire, save Ethan. You know it's the right thing to do. She looked through the window into Ethan's hospital room. Her baby, so small in that big bed, hooked up to machines that beeped his fragile heartbeat. The only thing she had left in the world. The only thing that mattered. Grant arrived, breathless. I'll pay for the surgery. Claire, don't sign anything. But Derek's lawyers were already there, blocking the way. Hospital policy. Only legal parents can authorize treatment. Miss Brennan's custody is contested. If Mr. Hastings wants to prevent outside financial interference, that's his right. It wasn't right. None of this was right. But the law didn't care about right. It cared about power, and Derek held all of it. Claire took the pen with shaking hands. Every signature felt like drowning. When she finished, Derek smiled, not triumphant, just satisfied. He'd won completely, and they both knew it. The surgery was scheduled for the next morning. Claire was allowed to see Ethan before they took him back, but only for 5 minutes, supervised. Mom, Ethan's voice was weak. I'm scared. I know, baby, but you're so brave. The bravest person I know. She kissed his forehead, memorizing the feel of his skin, the smell of his hair. I love you more than anything in this world. You remember that? Okay, no matter what happens. Are you going somewhere? No, sweetheart, never. I'll always be here. The lie tasted like ashes. But what else could she say? That she'd just lost custody because the world was cruel and money mattered more than love. They wheeled him away, and Claire collapsed in the hallway, sobbing so hard she couldn't breathe. Grant held her while she broke into pieces, and neither of them noticed the man watching from across the corridor. Todd Brennan, investigative journalist, who'd been following the Hastings case for very different reasons, and who just recorded Derek's blackmail on his phone. The surgery saved Ethan's life, but cost Claire her son. While he recovered, Derek's lawyers moved quickly, filing final custody orders based on Claire's signed agreement. She was granted supervised visitation twice a month, 2 days out of 30. That's what her love was worth in the eyes of the law. Claire moved through the following days like a ghost. She haunted coffee shops and libraries, places where she could sit for hours without anyone expecting anything from her. Grant kept calling, but she couldn't bear to answer. She'd failed. At everything. At love. At motherhood. At survival itself. Then Todd Brennan walked into the Queen's Diner where she was nursing her third cup of burned coffee. He slid into the booth across from her without invitation. Claire Montgomery, or should I say Claire Brennan. He had the lean, hungry look of someone who'd spent years chasing stories that mattered. I've been investigating Derek Hastings for 2 years. I know what he did to you. All of it? Great. Write your story. Add it to the pile of ways I've been destroyed. Claire didn't look up from her coffee. I don't want to destroy you. I want to help you destroy him. Todd placed his phone on the table, pulled up a video. I was at the hospital. I recorded his blackmail, him offering to pay for surgery in exchange for custody. That's coercion. Claire, it's illegal. She watched the video play. Derek's voice clear. You sign over custody, and I'll authorize the surgery immediately. There it was. Proof. The thing she'd needed all along. Why are you helping me? She asked. Because I've spent 2 years documenting Derek and Roger Sinclair's criminal enterprise. Money laundering, bribery, illegal weapons deals. Your father, Charles Montgomery, was investigating the same thing when he died. His car accident wasn't an accident. Derek and Roger had him killed to protect their business. The words should have shocked her, but they just felt inevitable. Of course, Derek's corruption went that deep. Of course, her father's death was connected. Can you prove it? Her voice was steady now, cold and focused. I can prove most of it, but I need your help with the rest. Todd leaned forward. Grant Westbrook has been working with me. He's been buying Derek's debt, gathering evidence, building a case. We're almost there. We just need one more thing. What? Derek's receiving a Developer of the Year award next week at the Manhattan Real Estate Gala. Every major player in the city will be there. If we can expose him publicly, with evidence and witnesses, the media attention will force federal prosecutors to act. But it has to be public. Claire, it has to be undeniable. Claire thought about Ethan, recovering in Derek's penthouse with nurses and nannies, calling another woman mom while Madison played stepmother. She thought about her father, who died trying to stop men like Derek. She thought about the woman she'd been 7 years ago, broken on courthouse steps in the rain. That woman was gone. But the woman who'd replaced her was something Derek Hastings had never anticipated. Someone who understood that revenge wasn't about emotion. It was about strategy. Tell me the plan, she said. They spent the next week preparing. Grant used his connections to ensure Claire had credentials to attend the gala. Todd compiled every piece of evidence into a multimedia presentation that would display on the venue's screens. And Julia Pierce, Claire's original divorce lawyer who'd never stopped believing in her, prepared legal documents that would invalidate the coerced custody agreement. The night of the gala arrived with crystalline perfection. Manhattan's elite gathered at the Plaza Hotel in their diamonds and designer suits, celebrating themselves and their success. Claire walked in wearing a red gown that Grant had insisted on buying, her hair swept up, her face calm. Derek stood near the stage, already holding his award, surrounded by admirers. Madison clung to his arm, playing the perfect wife. Neither of them noticed Claire slip into the crowd. Grant found her first. You look ready. I am. And she was. For the first time in 7 years, Claire felt absolutely certain of her purpose. Derek took the stage to thunderous applause. He smiled his most charming smile, the one that had once made Claire believe in fairy tales. Thank you all for this incredible honor. Real estate isn't just about buildings. It's about legacy, about the future we're building for our children. That's when the screens flickered. Derek's speech was replaced by Todd's video. Derek's voice filled the ballroom. You sign over custody, and I'll authorize the surgery immediately. The crowd went silent. Then came more. Financial documents showing money laundering through shell companies. Emails between Roger Sinclair and defense contractors. Photos of illegal weapons shipments. Audio recordings of bribes being negotiated. And finally, the classified file on Charles Montgomery's death, with notes indicating assassination ordered by Sinclair Organization. Derek's face went white. He tried to speak, but his microphone cut out. Instead, Todd's voice narrated over the evidence. Clinical and devastating. Derek Hastings built his empire on his father-in-law's criminal enterprise. He married Madison Sinclair for access to illegal funds. He coerced his ex-wife into signing custody agreements by withholding medical care from their dying son. He participated in the murder of a federal agent investigating his business, and tonight he was about to accept an award for being Manhattan's most respected developer. The ballroom erupted. Reporters rushed the stage. Cameras flashed. And through it all, Claire stood perfectly still, watching Derek's world collapse in real time. Federal agents appeared at the exits. Grant had tipped them off, ensuring they'd be present for the revelation. They moved toward Derek with practiced efficiency. Madison was screaming, her perfect composure shattered. He lied to me. He used me. I didn't know about any of this. She was lying. But Claire didn't care. Let Madison save herself if she could. Derek's eyes found Claire across the ballroom. For a moment, they stared at each other across the chaos. She didn't smile, didn't gloat, just watched him understand that the woman he'd destroyed had learned to destroy better. The agents handcuffed him on stage, reading rights that barely registered over the crowd's noise. As they led him away, Derek pulled against them one last time, shouting across the room, "Claire, please, Ethan needs his father." "Ethan needs a father who's not a criminal," she called back. "I guess he'll have to wait for you to become someone worth knowing." They took him away, and Claire turned to Grant. "Is it over, ma'am?" "The legal part is just beginning." "But the war," Grant smiled. "You won." 6 months later, the legal dust had settled into something resembling justice. Derek was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and accessory to murder. Madison divorced him before the trial ended, claiming she'd been deceived throughout their marriage. The courts believed her just enough to avoid prosecution, but not enough to give her access to what remained of Roger Sinclair's fortune. Hastings Development was dissolved. Its assets were sold to pay fines and restitution. The Manhattan Skyline project was completed under Westbrook Global's sole direction, with Claire at the helm. Full custody of Ethan was restored to Claire within weeks of Derek's arrest. The coerced custody agreement was voided, and Derek's parental rights were terminated based on his criminal convictions. Ethan had taken the revelations hard, struggling to understand how the father he'd barely known turned out to be a monster. Claire got him into therapy, gave him space to process, and held him when he cried. "Do you think he ever really loved me?" Ethan asked one night. Claire chose her words carefully. "I think your father loved the idea of you, the power and control you represented. But love, real love, means putting someone else's needs before your own. He never learned how to do that." "You love me like that," Ethan said. "I do, more than anything in this universe. Even though I look like him." "You look like you, sweetheart. You just happen to have inherited some features. But you're nothing like Derek Hastings. You're kind and curious and brave. You're exactly who you're supposed to be." Ethan hugged her tight. "I'm glad you came back, Mom." "I'm glad you didn't let him win." "Me too, baby. Me too." Westbrook Global's board reinstated Claire as CEO with a formal apology and a significant raise. She accepted on the condition that Grant remain as chairman. They made a good team, the old spy and the woman who'd learned to fight. The Manhattan Skyline project opened on a clear spring morning. The tallest building, the crown jewel of the development, bore a bronze plaque, Montgomery Tower, in memory of Charles Montgomery, who taught us that real courage means fighting for what's right, even when the pest is everything. Claire stood at the dedication ceremony with Ethan and Grant, looking up at the building that represented more than architecture. It was proof that broken things could be rebuilt, that destroyed lives could resurrect themselves, that sometimes the best revenge wasn't revenge at all. It was becoming everything your enemies said you couldn't be. Todd Brennan's articles won a Pulitzer. His investigation exposed corruption that reached far beyond Derek Hastings, leading to dozens of arrests and systemic reforms in how real estate development was regulated. He dedicated the award to Charles Montgomery. Julia Pierce joined Westbrook Global as general counsel, specializing in cases where legal systems failed vulnerable people. She won most of them. Madison Sinclair disappeared from New York society, last spotted working in a boutique in Connecticut, unrecognizable without her family's money and influence. As for Claire, she kept building. Sustainable housing projects in Detroit, affordable apartments in Los Angeles, green towers in Chicago, each one designed with the philosophy that architecture should serve people, not profit. Grant retired 2 years later, satisfied that his debt to Charles Montgomery was finally paid. At his farewell party, he pulled Claire aside. "Your father would be proud, not just of what you built, but of who you became." "I became who I had to," Claire said. "No, you became who you always were. Circumstances just gave you permission to show it." Grant smiled. "Take care of yourself, Claire Brennan Montgomery. Take care of that boy. And remember that the measure of a life isn't what happens to you. It's what you do with what happens." She hugged him, this man who'd saved her when she had nothing, and who'd believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself. On the 5th anniversary of Derek's arrest, Claire received a letter from him. She almost threw it away without reading. But curiosity won. His handwriting was the same, though shakier. "Claire, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. but I want you to know that I understand now what I lost. Not the company or the money or even my freedom. I lost the chance to know our son. I lost the only person who ever really loved me. I chose ambition over humanity, and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing that I destroyed the best thing I ever had. You were right, I was a monster. I hope Ethan grows up nothing like me, and I hope you found the peace I never could. Derek. Claire read it twice, then filed it away. Not forgiveness, but closure. Derek had finally learned what she'd known all along, that love and integrity and human connection mattered more than empires. He'd learned it too late, but he'd learned. She didn't write back. Some conversations were finished. That evening, Claire took Ethan to the roof of Montgomery Tower. The city spread below them in rivers of light, beautiful and brutal and full of possibility. Ethan was 12 now, almost as tall as her, with Derek's eyes but Claire's heart. Mom, he leaned against the railing. Do you ever wish things had been different, like if Dad hadn't been who he was and you guys stayed together? Claire considered the question seriously. I used to. When you were little and I was scared and alone, I wished so hard that none of it had happened. But if things had been different, you might not exist. I might not have become who I am. Sometimes the worst things lead to the best things, even though we can't see it while we're living through them. That's kind of deep, Mom, she laughed. Yeah, well, your mom got deep after getting her heart broken and rebuilding her entire life. You're pretty cool for someone who went through all that. Thanks, kid. You're pretty cool yourself. They stood together in comfortable silence, and Claire thought about the journey that had brought her here. The courthouse steps in the rain, the hospital bed where she'd almost lost it everything, the moment she'd signed away her son to save his life, the gala where she'd watched her enemy fall. All of it had led to this: a 12-year-old boy who knew his worth, a company that changed skylines, a life built on truth instead of lies. Sometimes revenge was necessary, but redemption, Claire had learned, was better. Redemption meant taking every terrible thing that happened and transforming it into something that mattered, something that helped people, something that lasted. Come on, she said to Ethan. Let's go home. They rode the elevator down through the building she'd designed, past offices where people worked to make the city better, through the lobby with its sustainable materials and energy-efficient lighting. Outside, New York rushed around them with its usual chaos, but Claire walked through it with certainty. She'd been broken on these streets. She'd disappeared and been reborn. She'd fought wars in courtrooms and boardrooms. She'd lost everything and built it back stronger. And in the end, she'd learned the most important lesson of all, that the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies. It's becoming so successful, so happy, so completely at peace that they become irrelevant. Derek Hastings was behind bars, but even if he'd been free, he couldn't touch her now. Not because she was protected, but because she was beyond his reach, beyond his understanding, beyond the small, cruel world where people were just assets to be acquired and discarded. Claire Montgomery had become something Derek could never comprehend, a woman who'd survived him and thrived anyway. And that, more than any revenge, was the truest victory of all.